Thanks guys for having me today. As Mark said, I am the current country manager until about 5 o'clock today. So it's great to have this event as my swan song, if we will. So as Mark briefly touched on, Wine Intelligence is a global market research and consumer insights agency. Our head office is in the UK and have been around for about 15 years. And what we mainly deal with is consumer reported insights and also trade insights. So we don't particularly deal in the specific sales volumes and values. We often use various secondary sources, and we also use the IWSR data quite a bit for this. So what I'm going to be looking at is what consumers say, which is great, but also sometimes frustrating. But it's still important to, I guess, overlay your value data, your sales data, volume data, and also what consumers are actually saying or what they're thinking. So just to provide a bit of context, I probably, because it's first thing on a Friday morning, I won't put anyone on the spot, but I just wanted you to have a think about the proportion of Australian adults who drink wine. So this is where we ask, which alcoholic beverages have you drunk in the past 12 months? So we've got 71%, 78%, or 82%. And what it's often important to remind the trade is that the answer is actually number one, 71%, which I know sounds quite basic, but when we do work in the trade, we kind of sometimes forget that not everyone in Australia who is an adult drinks wine. If we go further, what we also look at is regular wine drinkers. So when we do our online surveys, we talk to people who we define as regular wine drinkers, which scarily for some of us is at least once a month. So I'd probably be a super premium regular wine drinker if we're using that scale. But what we can see is we've got 71% of Australian adults who say they drink wine. And of that sample, 78% of them say they drink wine at least once a month. So that's either red, white, or rosé. So it does provide just a bit of context of not everyone in Australia, unfortunately, drinks wine. But there are a lot more positive signs. And to put a bit more context on that, per capita, it's actually ranked as 14th. So we've got quite a few, I guess, random smaller European countries have quite a high per capita consumption of wine. But in terms of, I guess, the US, New Zealand, we're higher than all of them. So my next question is, and I'll make it rhetorical so that I don't put anyone on the spot, is what proportion of these regular wine drinkers, and throughout this presentation when I say regular wine, I'm talking about those at least once per month, what proportion of those regular wine drinkers are women? Does anyone want to have a guess? Number three? It's a common assumption that people make, but it's actually 50-50. So another thing, and we often get it from perhaps various branding agencies that we work with or advertising agencies, is, oh, we're targeting wine drinkers, let's look at the channels that are female focused. But when we look at this regular wine drinkers, it's an even gender split. The next one, what proportion of these regular wine drinkers are aged 55 and over? Any guesses? 24%? Anyone else got a different answer? 36%. And this is another, I guess, assumption that a lot of people make globally as well, is often, again, when we're working with creative agencies or various providers, they're thinking that wine drinkers are these younger or middle-aged people who are hip and trendy and want to go out to on-premise locations all the time, and they often forget that a very large proportion, in this case around a third, of wine drinkers are aged over 55. And this is really something to take into consideration when you're thinking about how you're targeting these drinkers and what their motivations for drinking wine are, because they're not all going out on a Friday night wanting to have a beautiful glass or bottle of wine with dinner. So I just wanted to give you a little, I guess, I'm not saying that you're making these assumptions, but a little bit of context to start. And those are really some rough demographics, but what I wanted to talk about in more detail as well is the types of wine drinkers there are in Australia. So we often hear that people are targeting women aged 25 to 35, or men aged for a particular age group. But what we do at Wine Intelligence is that we look at a variety of attitudinal, motivational, and behavioural purchasing decisions. And we have a look at how can they fit into a different segment. So we actually do a factor and cluster analysis based on a lot of different questions, and it basically puts them all together and puts them into one of 6 consumer segments. So instead of talking about demographics, we're talking about different wine drinkers. And what we have here is we've given them 6 different names. And I thought I'd just go into a little bit of detail about each of these segments. Often when I'm talking about these segments, because I work looking at this data a lot, I have my own fictional people who represent each of these categories. And when I'm explaining them, you'll probably conjure some images of your own in terms of each of these segments. So first we have the adventurous explorers. We used to call them adventurous connoisseurs, but we actually changed the name of this segment. I was quite an advocate for this, even though a lot of people were like, it's just really a name, it doesn't really matter. But what I wanted to explain here is these adventurous explorers, they're our most involved in the wine category, but they also are quite involved in the alcoholic beverage category overall. So connoisseurs kind of indicated that they were the ones perhaps reading James Halliday, looking up different wine blogs, and there sure is a segment of them. But there's a lot of people who are involved in wine who really like it, but they're not seeing it as a hobby that they're going to go study every night. So we changed that from adventurous connoisseurs to adventurous explorers. And as you can see there, in terms of the share of Australian regular wine drinkers, they're making up about 19%. This screen's really small, Mark. Anyway. Our second segment is developing drinkers. So these guys are younger, higher spending drinkers, and their views towards wine are often quite conservative. This is because they're still getting to know the category, they're still navigating it, and they're higher spending because they're often using price as almost a proxy for quality. So they don't have, compared to adventurous explorers, they don't have that fundamental understanding and education about wine. So they're looking for lots of different cues to help them make their decisions a little bit more clear. They're also a little bit more externally motivated, so they care a bit more about what other people think of their wine choices. Adventurous explorers are sort of going, don't worry, I've got this. You know, I don't mind making kind of an out there decision because I know that I've got the knowledge and the education to back it up. Our third segment are our mainstream value seekers. This again was a linguistic change that we changed last year. They used to be called mainstream bargain hunters. This conversation led me to have lots of discussions with the UK team about what a bogan is, because I was trying to explain to them that bargain hunters sounded a bit bogan. They said, what is a bogan? And then we had this big conversation, and I didn't really know how to translate it. But I thought that bargain hunters really implied that they didn't really care about the wine, they were just looking for cheap wine. However, these guys are our most frequent wine drinking segment, and they're seeking value because they actually have quite a high level of knowledge about wine. But because of that, they know that's a $10 bottle of wine, and I know that's really good value because I know what I like, and I know that that cost is good for what I'm getting. So they're seeking value, not bargains. So they make up about 15%. Then we have our contented casuals. They're less frequent wine drinkers. They're often viewing wine as more of a weekend treat. They're happy to spend a little bit more because they're not drinking as much of it, so they can trade up a little bit more. And they make up quite a big segment, which often for producers and various people involved in wine, we don't really want them to be the biggest segment of wine drinkers because they're not buying that much wine. But it is important to know that there is a big segment out there who are buying wine, but it's a weekend thing, but they're still a little bit interested in wine, but they're not fully engaged and involved in thinking about wine all the time. Our fifth segment, we've got our newbies. So they are our youngest segment, and they're new to the wine category. They're also less frequent drinkers with a limited interest in wine. They're often drinking wine because maybe other people are drinking wine in their social circles. They've just started working. That seems like an appropriate beverage for them, but they really don't know much. They're probably our consumers that are going, there's white wine and there's red wine. I did lots of consumer interviews with these people. I learnt that common trick is often mixing Moscato and Sauvignon Blanc together. When you want a little bit of a sweeter wine, you just go half a glass of one, half a glass of the other. Learnt some great stuff, and I probably was one of these guys at uni, so I can't judge too much, but for us in the room, it's a little bit shocking to hear. But these guys, they're probably not differentiating past white wine, red wine. When I ask about particular varietals, I normally have to explain what varietals is, and then they're not telling me much, but Moscato is pretty popular with these guys. And our last segment here are older wine drinkers called our senior sippers. And they're also quite a big segment, and unfortunately, they're not high frequency and they're not high value. So in terms of when we have clients trying to target different segments, thus far no one has said we're going after the senior sippers because they don't see too much value in it, but they are a big segment, and I think some brands probably would like to think they're not popular with senior sippers, but some are. So this is how they make up in terms of the share of Australian regular wine drinkers. What we also do based on the questions that we ask quantitatively is we can figure out their share of volume of wine in Australia. So we can see that basically those top three segments, they become more prominent in terms of the proportion that they're dominating. So we've got our adventurous explorers increasing, also our developing drinkers, and our mainstream value seekers are the ones that are drinking most frequently. They're really becoming more prominent as a segment. Then we look at value. So we can see that the adventurous explorers and developing drinkers again become more prominent. The mainstream value seekers, they sort of shrink a bit because, as I was saying before, they're lower spending. But really what you can see is we've got the adventurous explorers and the developing drinkers being about 35% of the share of population, but they're almost 2/3 of the spend. So we often work with clients in terms of who they think their current consumer segmentation is, who their target segmentation would be, and I guess the pros and cons of which segment it is. And it's sort of just going one step further instead of just going basic demographics of gender and age. So if I refer to one of these segments throughout the presentation, this is what I'm talking about. So you might already be conjuring up some, I totally know a mainstream value seeker, or, you know, my mum is definitely a mainstream value seeker, my dad is definitely an adventurous explorer, and I'm probably somewhere in the middle. So it's often good to kind of paint a picture of them, and I will be referring to them throughout the presentation. Another way to look at them, just quickly, is we've plotted them on an axis for each of, I guess, a few wine drinking motivations. So in terms of frequency, you can see that mainstream value seekers are the highest on here, and newbies are the lowest. Developing drinkers, they're the ones that are still getting to know the category, having to rely on some traditional cues. They're still not the ones that are drinking often as a relaxing drink at the end of the day. They don't really see it as something that they're going to do at home and just have one glass, but if they're out in the on-premise, they're definitely going to be drinking wine. But they still haven't made it to, I think I'll just have one glass per night. And they're also one of the younger segments as well, so those things are all important to take into consideration. But when we look at the spend, developing drinkers jump quite a lot, because as I mentioned before, they're often using price as a proxy for quality. Contented casuals, I mentioned, they're the ones that are normally just buying wine on the weekends. They jump up a little bit in spend because it is that weekend treat, so they are happy to spend a little bit more. And we can see that senior sippers are right down there on the end, so they're not spending too much. They're often not going to spend more than $10 on a bottle of wine. And then the third measure here is involvement, or we could call it engagement within the category. So what's important to note here is, yes, we've got adventurous explorers as the highest involved, but the mainstream value seekers as well, they like wine. They're interested in wine, but they're, because of other different things that are going on, their spend is not as high, and they're happy and content with their knowledge. They're not really going to seek anything more. So it's important to take these things into consideration. So hopefully I've given you a little bit of context about who the kind of regular wine drinkers are that we speak to. Now I'm just going to go through some of the trends that we're seeing amongst these regular wine drinkers. So the first one that I wanted to outline here, and Mark sort of touched on it in terms of the Australian market, and that volume has been pretty stable in the past at least 5 years. But what we are seeing is a trend towards trading up, and I think there's been quite a bit of discussion about premiumization within the market. And what we're seeing as well is, there's obvious trends of people trying to perhaps cut down on alcohol consumption, drinking in moderation, but wine is still being seen as often a personal reward, a bit of a weekend treat, and within the context of alcoholic beverages, often one of the more healthy options. Would be great if we were in China where they see grape-based wine as great for their health. If we could get that message across in Australia, that would be great. But in comparison to a lot of other beverages, it is still being seen as that relaxing time, everyday treat. And we also tested a number of trends amongst these wine drinkers, and mindfulness was actually the most important trend amongst regular wine drinkers, and even more in the context of wine. So they're making this link between wine can facilitate that mindfulness, whether it's reading a book at the end of the day, having a relaxing drink. They're seeing it as a very appropriate beverage to try and relax. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was the growing experimentation amongst wine drinkers. So one of the questions that we ask regular wine drinkers, and it's just a single select, so they can only select the statement that's most relevant to them, is we've got 3 statements. I know what I like and I tend to stick to what I know in the context of wine. I don't mind what I buy so long as the price is right. And I enjoy trying new and different styles of wine on a regular basis. So what we can see there is the largest proportion, or the statement that was selected with the largest proportion of people, is actually that I enjoy trying new and different styles on a regular basis. And that red asterisk that is there actually means that that has significantly increased since last year. So we've got more people saying I enjoy trying new things, less people, well, the light blue on the light blue probably isn't coming across very well, but we've got a light blue asterisk on that 26%. And that's, I don't mind what I buy so long as the price is right. So we've sort of got people migrating from more price-driven to I'm happy to have a bit of a go. And what we're seeing that behaviour come out in is in a number of different areas. So first of all is country of origin. As Mark touched on, Australia is still quite dominated by domestic wine, and the majority of our imported wine is from New Zealand. So some would say imported, but only semi-imported because they're so close. But we are seeing a significant increase in the proportion of people who are saying that in the past 6 months they've drunk wine from New Zealand, Spain, Italy, France, and Chile. Now, granted, this is consumer-reported data, so sometimes Australians might have a Spanish-sounding varietal and they might think that they're drinking Spanish wine and they're not, and that I'll touch on that in a minute. But they are thinking that they are diversifying in terms of thinking outside Australia and New Zealand. That also has had a flow-on effect in terms of the varietals that people are saying that they've consumed in the past 6 months. So in particular, we've got Malbec, Tempranillo, and Sangiovese. The proportion of people who are saying that they've drunk that varietal in the past 6 months has significantly increased in the past few years. And it's sort of a flow-on effect. So when people are, I guess, experiencing different grape varieties from different countries, it's making consumers a little bit more open-minded to trying those varietals from Australia as well. So we get people saying, I've had an Australian Sangiovese. I know I have. I've had a Malbec from Australia. Sometimes they get a little bit confused, but at least they're going, sort of sounds familiar, think I've had that. We're also seeing a significant increase in Pinot Noir as well. So basically just we've still got Shiraz and Merlot and Cab Sav leading in terms of consumption reach, but all those, I guess, more alternate varietals in the past few years increasing. They're still not in danger of taking over the big 3 though anytime soon. And lastly, in terms of growing experimentation among wine drinkers, is region of origin in Australia. So previously we kind of just heard the big ones of I know Barossa, I know McLaren Vale, I know Hunter Valley, some association which regions were good for which varietals, but we're hearing more and more different regions coming out amongst consumers. So I would say overall Australian consumers are still struggling a little bit with associating different regions with different varietals. Remembering we're not like the Europeans having that really strong link, they're still coming from a varietal and brand-led focus. But we are seeing that consumers are more and more likely to have said that they're buying wine from a number of different Australian regions as well. The next one I'm going to talk about is one of everyone's favourite topics at the moment, sparkling. So what we're seeing is that there is, I guess, pardon the pun, ongoing potential for the sparkling bubble. So what we're seeing is Australian sparkling wine is still the sparkling wine that has the broadest consumption reach, but in terms of the proportion of people who are saying that they've drunk champagne, sparkling wine from New Zealand and Prosecco, which is another conversation about Prosecco, has increased. But the interesting thing is here, the proportion of people who are saying that they've drunk sparkling at least once a month. So compared to data from around 5 years ago, sparkling was often still seen as a drink appropriate for celebrations, perhaps on the on-premise, not really a drink that you're going to have at the end of the day. It's still not really seen as an appropriate everyday beverage, but the growing number of people who are drinking it more frequently does imply that it's being seen as a bit more of an approachable drink and less just about celebrations. And that's also probably to do with the different types of sparkling that are becoming more prominent in the market, and also marketing from various associations and brands saying sparkling doesn't have to be just about celebrations. So one of the questions that we ask amongst sparkling wine drinkers is we ask for each of the different types of sparkling that they drink, we ask them to rate on a scale of 0 to 10 in terms of quality perception and value for money. So the sparkling types that we test are Cava, Australian Prosecco, Italian Prosecco, sparkling from New Zealand, sparkling from Australia, and champagne from France. Now I guess before I even go into the results, I will say a few caveats. Does everyone that we ask know that champagne has to be from France? Because we know in Australia, we still have a lot of people saying anything with bubbles is champagne. We have from France there, but I can't guarantee that everyone is still going, yes, I definitely know that my champagne is from France, but it's still the association of this is what champagne is. The other question that we get asked, do you think consumers know the difference between Australian Prosecco and Italian Prosecco? And I know this has been discussed in the media a lot as well, and the Italians are not happy about it, etc. Our personal opinion is that some do, but there's still, because it's a relatively new category, often something like Prosecco is just often seen as a brand in itself. So when we ask consumers to name particular brands of Prosecco, they struggle quite a bit. So they're seeing it as the brand is Prosecco, and maybe in a couple of years' time, that's when you can ask about sub-brands. So when we look at the quality perception, we see that champagne has the highest mean for quality perception, which we get every year, and it doesn't really surprise anyone. We also see that Cava has the lowest. And this is an interesting one because I would say in the Australian market, Cava is still relatively unknown. So I think it's probably, and when you look at the value for money perception as well, I think what it's indicative for Cava is that people aren't really sure what it is. Yes, they've had it, but they don't really know what kind of quality is it, what kind of value for money is it. I'm not really sure because, well, me personally, I think Cava's great value for money. But people that don't really know that much about it, they're not likely to put it up there. So when we have a look at quality perception as well, we can see that sparkling wine from Australia actually performs quite well. And that Italian Prosecco and Australian Prosecco are relatively even, but we do have a slightly higher quality perception for Italian Prosecco, which really is indicative of Australians' view of, I guess, a flow-on of tall poppy syndrome when we do assume that Europeans do wine better than us sometimes. In the room, I would say that I'm sure there's lots of arguments that that's not true, but when we talk to Australian consumers, they still do have a, well, the Europeans, they've been doing it for ages and they must be better than the Australians. When we look at value for money perception, sparkling wine from Australia also does quite well as well. Value for money is, I guess, a little bit more of a difficult one to measure because it's a more subjective thing, so it depends the dollar amount that people find is good value, and it also depends on the quality that they're associating and those two factors combining. But we can see that champagne performs the worst for value for money. So we're seeing it great quality, bad value for money. But when we look at those two measures, Australian sparkling wine is actually sitting in quite a positive category. The other thing that I wanted to talk about for sparkling wine is we ask a number of statements in our sparkling wine surveys amongst sparkling wine drinkers and our still wine surveys. And we ask a number of statements. So in the sparkling wine survey, we say, for example, drinking sparkling wine gives me pleasure. Generally speaking, sparkling wine is an expensive drink, etc. When we're in the still wine survey, we have the same statements, but it's wine, not still wine, just wine. So the navy there is the drinkers of still wine and their various attitudes. So we can see that in comparison to sparkling wine, we still see that still wine is still far more associated with giving you pleasure in terms of just a relaxing day drink at the end of the day. When we look at, for example, I have a strong interest in sparkling wine / still wine, we can see that the proportion of those still wine drinkers who are saying that is significantly higher than sparkling wine. So what it shows with these statements is that there really is still room for increased engagement and knowledge of the sparkling wine category compared to the still wine. And I think that will just change over time as well. But at the moment, sparkling wine is still just not as clear a proposition amongst regular wine drinkers or sparkling wine drinkers as still wine is. The next topic that people love to talk about is rosé. So when you read, I guess, some articles in the media, you'd think that rosé is taking over the world. Not quite yet, but the proportion of regular wine drinkers who are saying that they've drunk rosé in the past 6 months has significantly increased in the past few years. When we talk to people in the trade, they are quite baffled about how prominent rosé is in the on-premise. We talked to one on-premise buyer saying that they still have 2 rosés by the glass in the middle of winter, which to them a few years ago was completely unheard of. But the interesting thing to note, again, is often an assumption in terms of who rosé drinkers are. So there is often the assumption that rosé drinkers are predominantly female, which they are a little bit, but it's not a huge skew of 80% to 20% in terms of the people that are saying they've drunk it in the past 6 months. And also in terms of age groups, we hear a lot of talk about how millennials are driving the rosé trend, which is certainly true in some respect because they do over-index in that 25 to 34 age group. But we still do have people of all age groups drinking rosé. And that's, like I was talking about in terms of a third of regular wine drinkers being over 55, remembering that there is a relatively even gender distribution and age distribution amongst rosé drinkers is also important. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was the opportunity for various sympathetic winemaking types and eco wines. So I want to say this in, I guess, 2 different ways. So we hear more and more from consumers that they're really interested in organic wine, in natural wine, in biodynamic wine, in preservative-free wine, sulfur-free wine, etc. When pressed about any further information, they know pretty much nothing. So it's kind of this catch-22 for them because in a lot of consumers' minds, there's this really romantic notion of how wine is made anyway, and it's often seen as natural to them as well. So they're picturing very sympathetic ways of production, hand-picking all the grapes, getting put in a barrel, taking shoes off, stomping the grapes around, and then they just end up in your bottle and it's completely natural. They also assume that organic wine just means that it's completely natural, nothing added. They have no idea about what would constitute organic wine versus natural wine versus biodynamic wine. I guess as a comparison, in a previous research job, I had to do a number of focus groups about jam. And I asked, what's important in the jam? What would you like to see in jam? And consumers consistently told me, love to see no added sugar. And I'd say, okay, you're always right. I'm not going to question you. So when we think about jam, what goes in jam? Everyone tells me, fruit and sugar. So non-judgmental. Okay, so you know that the ingredients in jam are fruit and sugar, but you want a jam with no sugar. So it's kind of indicative of consumers. They love the idea that they're going to have a natural wine or an organic wine. Do they actually know what that means? Often no. but they'd like to say that they're having an organic wine. So this area is going to be interesting because sometimes you almost run the risk of informing the consumer about how wine is often made, which kind of, dims their dream about wine a bit, and then you're saying, but no, mine is good because I don't do that. So it's, I guess, an interesting area to navigate in terms of educating consumers and for them to understand the various types of eco-friendly wine. So Mark also highlighted in the producers survey that there was quite a bit of mention of direct-to-consumer channels and online, etc. And we recently did some research in terms of understanding cellar door visitation in the different channels. So what I first wanted to highlight, this is a ranking of the proportion of visits to wine regions for the purpose of visiting a winery or cellar door. So the way that we calculated this was by the proportion of people who said they'd visited that region, and then the frequency of people that had visited each region, and we times it together. And so this is the list of the top 10. We also asked questions, as a starting question, we asked, have you visited a winery or a wine region for the purpose of visiting a winery or cellar door in the past 12 months? So we had 53% of regular wine drinkers saying they'd been to a wine region to visit a cellar door or a winery in the past 12 months. Now, remembering this is amongst regular wine drinkers, so they're already drinking wine at least once a month. But that's quite a high proportion. And then we have 36% saying they haven't gone in the past 12 months, but they have been before. So we had just 10% of people saying they had not been to a wine region for the purpose of visiting a cellar door or a winery. And I think that was quite surprising for some people because it is quite a high proportion. And we do have to remember this is amongst regular wine drinkers rather than everyone. But we saw that those aged 25 to 34 were even more likely to say that they'd visited a wine region in the past 12 months. And if we think back to our portrait segmentation, some people might be able to guess, but we had adventurous explorers and developing drinkers even more likely to have visited in the past 12 months. So we also asked some more questions in terms of people who had bought wine from either a wine region direct from the cellar door or through other direct channels. So we asked them, we provided 4 channels. So we asked wine clubs, so through a newspaper organisation or an online wine club, a bottle shop website or online retailer, cellar door or winery through mail order or online, and then from a cellar door. What we found was, in terms of the value of the average bottle of wine, the highest per bottle spend is direct from a cellar door or winery. When we talked to those amongst the trade, they often said that because they were able to engage with consumers and actually explain to them why it might be better to pay more money for this bottle of wine or to taste the wine and feel like they were imparting education, they were more likely to have a higher spend. Per bottle spend on average was lowest when it was direct from a bottle shop's website or online retailer. So they were really seeing, I guess, more value in terms of buying online from retailers, but the price per bottle was highest when it was direct from the cellar door. In contrast, we also figured out the average amount of bottles, so I guess basket size, and direct from a cellar door or winery during a visit had the lowest basket size amongst those 4 channels, and the largest basket size was from a wine club. So you can see that when Mark was talking about the different channels that might be available and focusing on different areas, it sort of depends on what you're trying to get at. If you're trying to engage consumers and make them, I guess, trade up, then that cellar door option is probably a little bit more prominent for you. But if you're trying to get in that person's basket size through a wine club or online, you might have to take a little bit of that, I guess, add a little bit of that value proposition. And while we speak about online, I know that there's a lot of discussion about whether producers should have their direct e-commerce sites, whether they should just use online retailers, etc. And one of the questions that we ask amongst our regular wine drinkers every 6 months is, which of the following channels have you bought wine from? And when we have the online channel, it's actually still relatively low. So the proportion of people saying that they've bought wine from a retailer or from their local bottle shop or from a drive-through is all higher than online. And when we look at that through age and demographics, I think there's a lot of assumptions that perhaps the younger consumers are going to buy wine online, but we actually see there's no strong difference between the age groups of buying wine online. And if you think back to our portrait segmentation, which I know probably feels like forever ago when I started talking, we know that, for example, for developing drinkers, they're our consumer group that aren't that confident in their wine choice. The proposition of buying wine online and often having to commit to a case, or at least 6 bottles, when they don't know that much about wine, it's very scary for them. So if anything, mainstream value seekers are our most likely segment to buy wine online, or adventurous explorers. So those more involved people in the category. However, they're also the more people that are quite likely to buy wine from Dan Murphy's because they appreciate the range, or the mainstream value seekers appreciate the price. So I think just taking away that in terms of buying wine online, it's still relatively uncommon, and it's not just driven by young people. All right, the last thing that I wanted to talk about, which might be a little bit different to the rest of my presentation, is that, so I've said we love becoming adventurous and everyone wants to try different new varietals and regions and countries, but we need to still remember that Australian wine drinkers are still often drawn to conservative and safe. So what I mean by that, if we look, we also did a study in terms of the top style descriptors for white wine and red wine. And this wasn't sensory, this was just online testing of words only. We asked the appeal of a number of style and flavour descriptors for white wine and red wine. And I put the top 5 on the slide here, and you can see that really they're quite conservative and common descriptors. There are some differences between men and women. For example, women are more likely to find easy drinking, fresh, delicate and light more appealing, and men are also more likely to find dry and oaky more appealing. If we look at the portrait groups, for example, newbies are more likely to find sweet an appealing descriptor. But mainstream value seekers are more likely to find crisp and dry as appealing descriptors. And then we've got the contented casuals, who are our kind of weekend wine drinkers. They're more likely to find delicate and elegant more appealing, which I think probably indicates that if they're seeing the wine as a little bit more of a treat, then they like those more stylish or premium descriptors. If we look at the least appealing, we had buttery, creamy, oaky, herbaceous, and dry were our 5 least appealing. So I'm not saying everyone go out and change your labels and say it's easy drinking, fresh, smooth, crisp, and fruity. But I am saying you need to think about, one, what your wine tastes like, because it does need to reflect what it tastes like. But you need to think about, yes, there are, for example, our adventurous explorers, they're more likely to find pretty much every description under the sun more appealing because they can kind of navigate their way through all the different descriptors and they understand what it means. But they still have these ones relatively as their top descriptors. So there still is that element of, I need to feel a little bit comfortable. And it's probably, I don't know, a chicken or the egg scenario because these are the ones they probably see most on their labels. So they've been, programmed to go, these are the ones that are appealing to me. And it's often the same story with the top red style descriptors. So we have smooth, easy drinking, full-bodied, fruity, and rich. So really they're motivated by a balance of mellow characteristics supported by full of flavour indicators. And if we have a look at portrait groups, again, newbies, loving the appeal of sweet, and mainstream value seekers, they're less likely to find descriptors like fruity, light, sweet, and juicy appealing. So if anything, I guess maybe our mainstream value seekers have drunk so much wine that they don't want the light characteristics. They want, give me some full-bodied wine because they're often drinking it quite frequently. So I guess it's a mix of knowing that different groups are wanting to try different things, but to understand that inherently we do have a, gravitation towards things that we find comforting and relatively safe. And finally, I just wanted to finish on the same point about gravitating towards those safer options in terms of label design. So just explaining the methodology that we did. First of all, these wines are fake, so don't bother trying to go, where's this one from? We made them up. But what we did was We did a lot of qualitative research where we had hundreds of different labels and we asked consumers to group them into categories that they thought had similar characteristics. From that, we engaged a label designer to create a label that was fairly indicative of that category. So we're not saying that every wine has to fit in these 9 categories, but we can't test infinite amounts of labels. So there's some assumptions, especially among buyers or retailers or creative agencies, that the more out there designs will attract all the young drinkers. They'll just love it because it's kooky and it's crazy and it's great. But what we found, so we tested a number of measures like standout, the overall appeal, price expectation and quality, and we also tested the likelihood to buy. So what we found out in terms of the overall average likelihood to buy amongst regular wine drinkers is that yes, they might have done well in the more out there designs did well in the standout and sometimes the appeal among certain age groups. But in terms of likelihood to buy, overall, regular wine drinkers still gravitate towards the more conservative labels. In particular, when we look at the all the other measures, simple elegance, the one here, which probably, I don't know if you can see that well, that was sort of a mix of a little bit more contemporary, indicative of it's not a rolling hill or a picture of a vineyard on that label. It's something a little bit more contemporary, but it's still providing enough of those traditional choice cues for people to feel reassured. And when we look at the different age groups and portrait groups, younger drinkers, they were more likely to say that they would buy the more out there labels, but overall, they still ranked prestigious, simple elegance, the more conservative ones, they still rank them the highest. If we think about people who are new to the category and still trying to find their way, it's a little bit scary to go, I don't really know anything about this wine. It looks cool, but I also still need to know what it's going to taste like, and I still need to find a balance, I guess, of staying with category norms and branching out in terms of new designs. So I think that's why simple elegance performed quite well, because it was more of a merging of both. We also had adventurous explorers and developing drinkers likely to say that they'd buy all the wines, but they're still more likely to show a preference towards these more traditional labels. So I know that I've said a lot of stuff about there's new emerging trends, but I guess it's also to make sure that you look at this holistically in terms of we still do have a lot of conservative people who still like to stick to category norms in terms of wine. So it's finding that balance. So just to summarise, in terms of the trends that we've looked at, so at the start of the presentation, we were talking about how wine is increasingly supporting that personal reward and well-being, a little bit of trading up and seeing it as an everyday, a bit of a reward. The growing experimentation amongst wine drinkers in terms of country of origin, region of origin, and varietals. The ongoing potential for the sparkling bubble, and also that greater proportion of people who are drinking sparkling wine at least once a month. That Australian sparkling is seen as delivering quite good value for money. So that was the slide with the value for money and the quality perceptions. The room for increased knowledge and engagement within the sparkling category, so just less sparkling wine drinkers than regular wine drinkers feeling like they know about the category, feeling like they're involved in the category, and that it's that's part of their personal, I can't remember the word, anyway, move on. Rosé being enjoyed by an increasing number of Australians, and that the proportion in terms of age group and gender is quite balanced. The trend of exclude and obsession in terms of being the opportunity for eco and sympathetic wine production, with the caveat of consumers still don't really know what they're talking about. That the visitation to wine regions is a way to connect with consumers and also encourage that higher price per bottle. And finally, that despite Australians becoming more adventurous, we still do need to remember that Australian wine drinkers are still often drawn to conservative and safe. So thank you very much for your time, guys. Mark, you ruined me with you were 10 minutes early, so now I don't know what time I was meant to finish. But I think I've done it on time. Perfect. All right. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? Perfect. Yep.
The question about the adventurous and with the ageing population.
Yep.
Are they going to turn into senior sippers? Have you seen that?
Well, it's a good question. Yeah, so I get asked all the time, like, often various agencies want me to give them, spelling out an answer of tell me the timeline of a wine drinker. So there's some people assume you go from a newbie to a developing drinker to an adventurous explorer to a contented casual to a mainstream value seeker, etc. And it's kind of, you know, there could be various turning points. So you could be a newbie and just go straight to the contented casual section, or you could be an adventurous explorer for life. So we don't have criteria for ages for this segmentation. We don't say if you're aged between this age and this age, then you have to be this category. So I think in terms of adventurous explorers and the aging population, they could either maintain an adventurous explorer, they could turn into a senior sipper, or they could turn into a mainstream value seeker. So I know that's an annoying answer, but that's my answer on that one. Yep.
Can I ask you about parochialism? Tomorrow is I Choose SA Day, where we're encouraged to buy product just from South Australia.
Yep.
And I know that works in the food category quite well. Have you seen any evidence that says people are making informed choices about wanting to buy just from the state that they reside in? Have you seen any evidence that suggests there's that potential?
So I'm aware that I'm in South Australia right now, so I'll be careful with my answer. But overall, we do see South Australians as particularly parochial for wine consumption more than other states. People in New South Wales, I'm from Sydney and I know lots of other people from Sydney, they don't really care about buying wine from New South Wales. So we do see parochialism from certain states, in particular South Australia, Tasmania and Western Australia, which probably is not a surprise. And in terms of visitation to cellar doors, there's obviously a big correlation. So if you look at the data, when we ask about regions, wine from different regions that they've purchased in the past 3 months, and then we look what state they're from, there is definitely a correlation. But I would say that, yeah, South Australia and Tasmania especially are particularly parochial. It's tougher, especially with the smaller regions, because we'd love consumers to know heaps about all the different regions. But, for example, we see that people from Melbourne, they know about King Valley, but people outside of Victoria often still don't know about King Valley. So it's, I guess, raising awareness outside your state as well is the answer to that one. No? Oh, yeah.
Just another question. Obviously, you talk about changes in aptitude for sparkling wine, rosé, natural.
Mm-hmm.
What evidence do you have in terms of the size of those markets? Have you seen any change? Do you collect that type of information in terms of?
We don't collect sales or volume data, so we don't have any measures on the, I guess, natural part of it yet. So I would say, from my knowledge, that the category is relatively small in terms of we don't ask particular questions about it. IRI might have data, or Aztec or something like that. We don't ask frequency for those categories. So, for example, rosé, we can show the proportion of people who have drunk rosé in the past 6 months, but we currently don't have data on are those people drinking rosé 3 times a month versus once a month a couple of years ago. But the overall consumption reach of rosé has increased, and the consumption reach of the champagne, sparkling wine from New Zealand and Prosecco has increased. But sales and, I guess, market size of category, we could probably do it by combining a couple of different measures that we ask and do, like when we do the portraits in terms of the value and the volume, we could probably do some kinds of numbers on that, but we don't have specific data on that.